Arthur Vasconcelos was a man whose name echoed in the halls of wealth and power. His life was a symphony of high finance, lucrative deals, and endless luxury. Yet, beneath the tailored suits and lavish lifestyle lay a void he couldn't fill. On a cloudy Thursday morning, driven by a gnawing sense of dissatisfaction and a whisper from his childhood, he set out on a path that would alter the fabric of his life forever. Arthur's gleaming black car eased to a stop at the edge of a modest neighborhood, one he had only heard about in distant conversations with his late grandfather. The air smelled of rain-soaked pavement, and the hum of life here felt far removed from his penthouse view of the city. For a man who had made his fortune understanding the complexities of money and finance, this world was alien, yet oddly magnetic. He stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the uneven sidewalk, and began to walk. The sights overwhelmed him, children laughing as they ran barefoot through puddles, elderly men playing checkers on makeshift tables, and the chatter of vendors hawking their goods. But it was the small vegetable stand on the corner that caught his eye. There, amid a cascade of fresh produce, stood a woman who seemed carved from the essence of resilience. Clara's hands moved deftly as she arranged tomatoes in a neat row. Her clothes were simple, worn but clean, and her hair, tied back in a loose bun, framed her face with an understated beauty. She wasn't extraordinary in the traditional sense, but there was a quiet dignity in her presence that made it impossible for Arthur to look away. As if sensing his gaze, she glanced up, their eyes meeting for a fleeting second. In that moment, something shifted inside him, an unfamiliar pang of recognition, though he couldn't quite name it. "Need something, sir?" Clara's voice broke through his thoughts, steady and polite, though there was a flicker of caution in her tone. Arthur hesitated before nodding, realizing he hadn't even considered a pretense for lingering there. "A few tomatoes," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She handed him a small bag, her fingers brushing his briefly. "That'll be $3. As he reached for his wallet, Arthur's mind raced. $3, an amount so insignificant in his world, yet clearly vital in hers. He fumbled for cash, suddenly self-conscious of the wealth that defined his existence. He handed her a 10, waving off the change, and walked away, but not without glancing back once more. Clara had already turned to help another customer, her focus unwavering, as if the brief encounter had meant nothing. For Arthur, however, it lingered like an unanswered question. Later that evening, Arthur sat in his expansive living room, the city skyline sprawling beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. He had spent years mastering the art of investments and leveraging financial systems, yet his thoughts were consumed by a woman who sold vegetables to make ends meet. Why had she affected him so deeply? Perhaps it was the contrast between their worlds, or the quiet strength she exuded, strength he couldn't seem to find in himself anymore. As he swirled a glass of whiskey in his hand, a memory surfaced. His grandfather, once a humble grocer, had built the family fortune from a small market stall not unlike Clara's. He used to tell Arthur stories of grit and sacrifice, of nights spent counting pennies and dreaming of a better future. Those stories had shaped Arthur's ambitions, but somewhere along the way, he had lost the connection to their humanity. Clara's eyes, her determination, it was as though she had brought those stories back to life. He knew he had to return to that neighborhood, not just out of curiosity, but to understand why the encounter had unsettled him so profoundly. Was it guilt, a yearning for redemption, or simply the need to feel something real in a life dominated by numbers and transactions? He couldn't say. All he knew was that he needed to see her again. If stories like this resonate with you, where lives intersect in unexpected and meaningful ways, take a moment to subscribe and like. These tales of humanity and resilience deserve to be told and remembered. Arthur leaned back in his chair, staring into the city lights, which now felt dimmer than before. He couldn't shake the feeling that Clara held a piece of the puzzle he had been searching for, and for the first time in years, he felt compelled to follow his instincts. The questions swirling in his mind demanded answers, and he was determined to find them, even if it meant stepping further into a world he didn't yet understand. The next morning, Arthur found himself standing once more at the edge of the same neighborhood. The sharp scent of freshly baked bread and the murmur of early risers filled the air. It was quieter than the previous day, and the dampness lingering from last night's rain gave the streets a reflective sheen. His polished shoes felt out of place on the uneven pavement, but he didn't turn back. He made his way to Clara's vegetable stand, scanning the modest scene for her familiar figure. She wasn't there. The stand was still set up, the produce neatly arranged, but an older woman, perhaps in her 60s, stood in her place, her movements slower and less deliberate. Arthur hesitated, unsure if he should approach. Just as he turned to leave, he heard a voice behind him, looking for something. He turned, and there she was, her hair tied back, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. She looked different in the morning light, less weary, more present. There was something striking about her simplicity, an effortless beauty that seemed to carry the weight of her struggles. Arthur hesitated, fumbling for a reason to stay. "I wanted to thank you for the tomatoes," he said, his voice more formal than he intended. "They were excellent." Clara raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. Most people just say that when they come to buy more. Her directness caught him off guard, but he liked it. She wasn't afraid to speak her mind, even to someone who clearly didn't belong here. He smiled, offering her the faintest trace of charm. "Then I suppose I'll need more." She motioned to the stand and they walked over. Arthur noticed the older woman watching him, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she said nothing. Clara busied herself picking through the tomatoes, her movements as precise as they were the day before. "Do you always work this hard?" he asked, breaking the silence. She glanced up, her expression guarded. "Work doesn't stop just because you're tired." Arthur studied her face, searching for the cracks in her armor. There was a quiet strength in her words, but also a hint of exhaustion she couldn't quite hide. He had seen that look before, in his grandfather's old photographs taken during the early days of building the family empire. "What about your family?" he asked, unsure why he felt compelled to know more. "Do they help with the stand?" For a moment, she paused, as if weighing whether to answer. "My kids are too young to work, and I'd rather they focus on school anyway." Her voice softened as she spoke of them, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Lucas wants to be an engineer. Mariana talks about being a doctor one day." Arthur nodded, impressed. "Ambitious dreams." "Dreams don't come cheap," she said, almost as an afterthought. "But I'll do whatever it takes to make sure they don't have to struggle like this." Her words hung in the air, heavier than he expected. Arthur's world revolved around money, earning it, investing it, multiplying it. But he had rarely thought about it in the way Clara described. For her, money wasn't about luxury or security, it was about survival, about giving her children a chance at a better life. It was a stark reminder of how differently the concept of finances could manifest in two people's lives. As she handed him a bag of tomatoes, their hands brushed again, just as they had the day before. This time, he noticed a faint scar along the side of her palm. He wanted to ask about it, to learn more about the life etched into her skin, but he held back. Instead, he slipped a 20 into her hand, refusing to take the change when she protested. "Call it an investment," he said lightly, though his tone lacked the detachment he usually reserved for such phrases. Clara frowned, clearly uncomfortable, but she didn't argue further. Instead, she gave him a small nod, her expression unreadable. Arthur left without another word. The weight of her life, and the way it contrasted so sharply with his own, settling heavily on his shoulders. Later that day, back in his office, Arthur found himself unable to focus. His desk was covered in spreadsheets and reports, numbers detailing the financial health of his latest ventures. Usually, they commanded his full attention, but now they felt hollow. He thought of Clara's face, the way her eyes softened when she spoke of her children, the determination in her voice as she talked about their dreams. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He had spent years mastering the art of turning money into more money, but for the first time, he questioned its purpose. What good was his fortune if it didn't change lives? If it didn't matter to anyone but himself? Arthur glanced at the photo of his grandfather on the corner of his desk. The old man's eyes, sharp and resolute, seemed to look back at him, challenging him. The memory of those early stories, of struggle, of hope, of sacrifice, surged to the forefront of his mind. It was as though his grandfather were asking him to confront a truth he had long ignored. And as the evening sun cast long shadows across his office, Arthur made a decision. He didn't know what it would look like yet, but he knew he had to do something. Something more than just handing out $20 bills, something that mattered. This wasn't just about Clara or her children. It was about him too, about finding a way to bridge the chasm between the life he had built and the humanity he feared he had lost. The rhythm of the neighborhood felt different the next time Arthur returned. The air was alive with the clamor of children playing soccer, the thud of their makeshift ball echoing against the walls of narrow alleyways. Street vendors shouted over each other, their voices weaving a symphony of persistence and survival. For Arthur, this place had begun to feel like another world entirely, one where people made do with what little they had, and still, somehow, life carried on. He approached Clara's stand again, though this time he wasn't sure what he was looking for. She greeted him with a polite nod, less guarded than before, but still cautious. Arthur noticed how her fingers trembled ever so slightly as she rearranged the vegetables. Her resolve was palpable, but so was the weight she carried. "Back for more tomatoes?" she asked, her tone light but tinged with curiosity. "Not today," Arthur replied, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Actually, I wanted to ask you something. Do you have a few minutes?" Her brow furrowed and she crossed her arms. "Depends on what you're asking." "I'm organizing an event," Arthur began, choosing his words carefully. "A fundraiser for local businesses. I thought it might help people like you, small entrepreneurs, expand their reach." Clara blinked, clearly taken aback. "A fundraiser for people like me?" Her skepticism was unmistakable. "Why would someone like you care about a place like this?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment Arthur wasn't sure how to answer. He could have spouted something rehearsed, a polished line about corporate responsibility or giving back to the community, but that wasn't the truth. "Someone once told me that success means nothing if you forget where you came from," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "My grandfather used to run a stand just like yours. Everything my family has today started with something small, something real. I guess I've been trying to reconnect with that." Clara studied him, her expression unreadable. Then she shrugged. "I'm not sure what a fundraiser can do for me. My problem isn't exposure, it's money. And I doubt anyone from your world wants to invest in a vegetable stand." Arthur smiled faintly. "You might be surprised. Besides, this isn't just about you. It's about people like you. Hard-working, resilient, determined. You're the backbone of communities like this one, and people need to see that." Her gaze softened, though the skepticism lingered. "I don't know," she said slowly. "I don't have time for charity events. I barely have time to sleep." "It's not charity," Arthur countered. "It's opportunity. And if you don't come for yourself, come for your kids, Lucas and Mariana, right? This could be a chance to show them what's possible." Clara's lips parted slightly, as if to protest, but she stopped herself. Her eyes flicked to the corner of the stand, where her children sat working on homework. Lucas was hunched over a battered notebook, while Mariana whispered something encouraging, her tiny hands gesturing animatedly. The sight seemed to ground Clara, and when she turned back to Arthur, there was a flicker of something new in her expression. Hope, perhaps. "All right," she said at last, "but I'm not promising anything." "That's all I'm asking," Arthur replied, relieved. He handed her a small card with the event details, then paused. "Do you need help with anything? Transportation? Childcare?" "I'll manage," Clara interrupted, her tone firm. "I always do." As Arthur left the stand, he felt a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. Clara had agreed, but her hesitation was a reminder of how vast the divide between their lives truly was. He couldn't shake the sense that he was walking a fine line, one where his intentions might be misunderstood or even rejected, and yet he couldn't bring himself to stop. That evening, Arthur sat in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk beside him. The fundraiser was a gamble, but it was more than that. It was personal. He thought of Clara's children, of their dreams of becoming an engineer and a doctor, and he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. His wealth had come from decisions that prioritized profit over people, and now he was face to face with the consequences. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind. "The greatest investment you can make isn't in stocks or real estate, it's in people." Arthur had always admired the sentiment, but dismissed it as romantic idealism. Now he wasn't so sure. The event loomed on the horizon, and with it, questions that refused to leave him. Would Clara see this as a genuine gesture or a hollow attempt at absolution? Would the fundraiser even make a difference, or was it just another distraction from his own guilt? For a man who had built his life on certainties, Arthur found himself in unfamiliar territory, uncertain, vulnerable, and strangely alive. The uncertainty gnawed at him as he stared out the window, the city lights flickering like distant stars. Somewhere out there, Clara was likely tucking her children into bed, her mind heavy with worries he couldn't begin to comprehend. And yet, their lives had intersected in a way neither of them could ignore. What came next, Arthur realized, would depend on whether he had the courage to bridge the gap between them. The night of the fundraiser arrived, and the event hall glimmered under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. It was a world of silk ties, delicate hors d'oeuvres, and whispered conversations about investments and financial markets. For Arthur, it was familiar, predictable even. Yet tonight, it felt strangely foreign. The polished facade of wealth and ease seemed out of sync with the thoughts that had consumed him in recent days. Clara arrived just after the first speeches had concluded. She wore a simple dress, one borrowed from her elderly neighbor, as she later admitted with a hint of embarrassment. It wasn't extravagant, but it carried her dignity in every stitch. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and though she lacked the diamonds and designer labels that adorned the other guests, she walked in with her head held high. Arthur spotted her immediately. She looked uncomfortable, her hands gripping the small clutch bag she carried. Beside her, Lucas and Mariana clung to her skirt, their wide eyes scanning the opulent room. For a moment, Arthur hesitated. Would she resent him for bringing her into a space so far removed from her reality? He pushed the thought aside and approached her, his smile warm but cautious. "You made it," he said, his voice cutting through the hum of conversation. Clara nodded, glancing around. "This is different," Arthur chuckled. "That's one way to put it." Before he could say more, one of his business associates interrupted, extending a hand to Clara. "And who is this?" Arthur introduced her with an ease that surprised even him. "This is Clara. She runs a local produce stand and has one of the most hard-working families I've ever met." Clara blushed faintly. unsure of how to respond. The man smiled politely, though there was a flicker of condescension in his eyes that made her bristle. Arthur noticed, but chose not to acknowledge it. Instead, he steered Clara toward the center of the room, where a large board displayed the evening's agenda. "Your table is over there," he said, gesturing to a quieter corner. "I thought you might feel more comfortable away from the crowd." Clara nodded again, grateful for the gesture. Lucas and Mariana followed her closely, their small hands gripping hers as if the room might swallow them whole. Arthur watched them go, a strange mix of pride and protectiveness swelling in his chest. The fundraiser proceeded as planned, with speeches from prominent figures and promises of change. Arthur spoke briefly, his words carefully chosen to resonate with both the wealthy donors and the struggling small business owners in attendance. He mentioned Clara without naming her, describing her as a symbol of resilience and hope. The room responded with polite applause, though Arthur's eyes sought only one reaction, hers. Clara met his gaze from across the room, her expression unreadable. She had never been one for grand gestures or lofty words, but something in Arthur's speech struck a chord. For the first time, she wondered if his intentions were genuine, if he truly understood the weight of the struggles she carried. As the evening wound down, Arthur approached her table. "How are you holding up?" Clara glanced at her children, who had fallen asleep in their chairs, their small bodies slumped against each other. She smiled faintly. Better than them, apparently. Arthur chuckled, then gestured toward the stage. "I meant what I said up there. People like you are the reason events like this matter." Clara sighed, her gaze drifting toward the empty plates in front of her. "I'm not sure what difference it'll make. These people," she motioned to the crowd, "they'll go back to their lives tomorrow. Nothing changes for people like me." Arthur didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled out a small folder from his jacket and slid it across the table. "Open it." Clara hesitated, then flipped it open. Inside were documents outlining a grant program Arthur had developed specifically for small businesses in underserved communities. Her name was at the top of the list, along with a modest but significant amount earmarked for her stand. "I wanted you to see this first," Arthur said, his tone softer now. "This isn't just about tonight. It's about building something real, something lasting." Clara stared at the papers, her hands trembling. The amount wasn't enough to change her life overnight, but it was more than she had ever dared hope for. It was a chance, a lifeline. Her eyes met Arthur's, and for the first time, she allowed herself to trust him, just a little. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Arthur's expression softened. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because I've spent too much of my life thinking about money and not enough about what it can do for people." Clara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she folded the papers carefully and placed them back in the folder. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "This will help, more than you know." Arthur nodded, relief washing over him. "It's a start," he said, "but it's just the beginning." As the evening came to a close, Clara gathered her children and prepared to leave. Arthur walked them to the door, his mind already racing with plans for what came next. Clara's doubts lingered, but so did a flicker of hope, a fragile thread that tethered her to the possibility of something better. Arthur watched her disappear into the night, his thoughts heavy with the weight of her words. Nothing changes for people like me. He was determined to prove her wrong, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. Change, he realized, would require more than money. It would demand something far greater: sacrifice, courage, and an unwavering commitment to a future he was only beginning to imagine. Days turned into weeks, and Clara found herself navigating a strange new reality. The grant Arthur had provided allowed her to expand her vegetable stand. New produce, better shelving, even a small canopy to protect her from the harsh sun and rain. Yet, as much as it helped, it also brought new challenges. Customers questioned the sudden changes, whispers of her connection to Arthur swirling like the morning fog that often settled over the neighborhood. Clara couldn't shake the unease that followed her. The money, though well-intentioned, had painted a target on her back. Some people envied her apparent good fortune, while others speculated about her relationship with Arthur. The insinuations stung, but Clara kept her head down, focusing on her work and her children. Arthur, meanwhile, became a more frequent visitor. He would stop by the stand on his way to work, dressed impeccably in suits that seemed almost absurd against the backdrop of cracked pavement and weathered storefronts. Clara tried to discourage him, fearing the attention his presence brought, but he was persistent. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Arthur said one morning as he handed her a fresh cup of coffee. "I just want to see how you're doing." Clara took the cup reluctantly, her fingers brushing his briefly. "People are talking," she said quietly, her eyes darting to the small crowd gathered near the corner. "They think there's something between us." Arthur raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Is that such a bad thing?" She shot him a sharp look, her cheeks flushing. "It is when it distracts from the work I'm trying to do. I don't want people thinking I'm some charity case, or worse." His smile faded, replaced by something more serious. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you. If my presence is a problem, I'll keep my distance." Clara hesitated, torn between gratitude and frustration. "It's not just about you," she admitted. "This isn't your world, Arthur. People here don't trust easily, and when someone like you comes around, it makes them question everything." Arthur leaned against the stand, his gaze steady. "Maybe that's exactly why I should be here. To show them that people from my world can care about more than just money." Clara sighed, her shoulders sagging. "It's not that simple." "Nothing worthwhile ever is," Arthur said softly. Their conversation was interrupted by Lucas and Mariana, who came running up with their backpacks slung over their shoulders. Lucas held a crumpled piece of paper in his hand, his face lit with excitement. "Mom, look what I got on my math test." Clara took the paper, her eyes widening as she read the bold red A scrawled at the top. "Lucas, this is amazing," she exclaimed, pulling him into a tight hug. Arthur watched the exchange, a small smile playing on his lips. "Looks like someone's got a bright future ahead." Lucas beamed, and for a moment the tension between Clara and Arthur melted away. Mariana tugged at Arthur's sleeve, her voice small but insistent. "Do you think Lucas could really be an engineer someday?" Arthur crouched to her level, meeting her curious eyes. "I don't just think so, I know so. With talent like his and a mum like yours, anything is possible." Mariana smiled shyly, and Lucas puffed out his chest with pride. Clara watched the interaction, her emotions a tangled mix of gratitude and wariness. Arthur's presence was undeniably impactful, but she couldn't ignore the complexities it brought into her life. Later that evening, as Clara prepared dinner, she couldn't stop thinking about Arthur's words. Maybe that's exactly why I should be here. She wanted to believe him, to trust that his intentions were genuine. But a voice in the back of her mind reminded her of the power dynamics at play, the unspoken gap between their worlds that no amount of goodwill could easily bridge. Meanwhile, Arthur sat in his penthouse, staring at the city lights. His meetings that day had been a blur of numbers and negotiations, yet his thoughts kept drifting back to Clara and her children. He was used to solving problems with money, but this was different. Clara didn't just need financial support. She needed trust, security, and a sense of belonging that couldn't be bought. Arthur reached for the folder on his desk, flipping through the pages of his latest proposal. He had been working on a plan to bring sustainable investment to neighborhoods like Clara's, creating opportunities that would empower people rather than simply handing them aid. It was ambitious, risky even. But Arthur was beginning to realize that the greatest returns often came from the boldest moves. As he closed the folder, his phone buzzed with a message from one of his assistants. The board was questioning his recent decisions, particularly the resources he had allocated to the grant program. Arthur sighed, the weight of their scrutiny pressing down on him. He had always prided himself on his ability to navigate corporate politics. But this was different. This wasn't just about business, it was personal. The night deepened and both Arthur and Clara found themselves staring into the darkness, their thoughts racing. For Clara, it was the fear of what might come next, the uncertainty of a life suddenly entangled with someone like Arthur. For him, it was the realization that he was no longer simply helping her, he was changing himself in the process. Neither of them knew what the future held, but one thing was clear, their lives were no longer their own. They were intertwined now, bound by something neither of them fully understood but couldn't walk away from. Arthur sat in the back seat of his sleek car, staring out the window as the city blurred into streaks of light and shadow. His mind buzzed with the echoes of the boardroom meeting he'd just left. The tension was palpable as they questioned his latest decisions, particularly his growing involvement in the grant program. It was a departure from the high-stakes deals that had defined his career, and the board wasn't pleased. "You're letting emotions cloud your judgment," one of them had said, their voice sharp and cutting. Arthur had responded with measured calm, explaining the long-term potential of investing in struggling communities. But the skepticism in their eyes lingered. For a man who had built his empire on cold logic and strategy, his recent actions seemed irrational to those who had profited from his past ruthlessness. As the car rolled to a stop near Clara's neighborhood, Arthur took a deep breath. He hadn't told her he was coming, unsure of how she'd react to his unannounced visit. When he stepped out, the air smelled of damp earth and frying food, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of the city center. He adjusted his tie, a reflexive habit, and walked toward her stand. Clara was there, as always, her hands busy sorting through a pile of ripe oranges. When she saw him, her expression shifted from surprise to guarded curiosity. "You're back," she said, her voice steady but lacking warmth. Arthur nodded. "I needed some air, thought I'd stop by." Clara straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Rough day in your world of big money?" The comment was meant to sting, but Arthur only smiled faintly. "Something like that." She eyed him for a moment, then gestured toward an empty crate nearby. "If you're staying, you might as well sit. You're making my customers nervous standing there in that suit." Arthur chuckled and complied, perching on the crate with an awkwardness that made Clara smirk. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The noise of the street filled the silence, voices haggling over prices, the occasional honk of a passing car, the laughter of children playing nearby. Finally, Clara broke the quiet. "Why are you really here, Arthur?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I wanted to see how you're doing. And I've been thinking about what you said. About how nothing changes for people like you." Clara's eyes flickered with something, hope, doubt, he couldn't tell. And I want to prove you wrong," he said simply, her brow furrowed. "That's a nice sentiment, but it takes more than good intentions to fix a broken system." Arthur leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know. That's why I'm not just throwing money at the problem. I want to build something sustainable, something that gives people a real chance. But I need your help." Clara laughed softly, a hint of bitterness in her tone. "My help? What could I possibly offer someone like you?" "You see things I don't," Arthur replied, his voice earnest. "You understand the struggles, the obstacles, the real needs of people in this community. I can't do this without that perspective." Clara stared at him, her expression softening despite herself. She wanted to dismiss his words, to tell him he was wasting his time. but there was something in his eyes, an intensity that felt genuine. Against her better judgment, she decided to hear him out. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked cautiously. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He handed it to her, watching as she scanned the neatly printed text. It was a blueprint for a cooperative initiative. Microloans, mentorship programs, and community-driven projects aimed at empowering small businesses and families like hers. Clara's fingers tightened around the paper. It's ambitious," she said quietly. Arthur shrugged. "Ambition is what I do best." She couldn't help but smile, though it quickly faded. "But why me? Why do you care so much?" Arthur hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Because I've spent my life chasing money, and I thought that was enough. But meeting you, seeing how hard you fight for your kids, for your future, it reminded me of something I'd forgotten. My grandfather used to say that money is only as good as what it does for the people who need it most. I think I'm finally starting to understand what he meant." Clara's throat tightened, the weight of his words hitting her harder than she expected. She looked down at the blueprint, her mind racing with possibilities. For years, she had fought alone, scraping by with no one to lean on. The idea of someone like Arthur, with all his resources and influence, offering his support, it was overwhelming. But with hope came fear. It could work, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. But it could also fail. And if it does, people here will lose what little trust they have left. Arthur met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "Then we won't let it fail." The conviction in his voice startled her. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, change was possible. Their conversation was interrupted by Mariana, who came running up with a piece of paper in her hand. "Mom, look, I drew this in school." Clara took the paper and smiled. It was a crude but charming drawing of their family, with a small figure standing off to the side. "Who's this?" she asked, pointing to the figure. Mariana grinned. "That's Mr. Arthur. He's helping us, right?" Clara glanced at Arthur, who was smiling faintly, his eyes soft with an emotion she couldn't quite name. She folded the drawing carefully and patted Mariana's head. "We'll see, sweetheart. We'll see." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Arthur stood to leave. "Think about it," he said, nodding toward the blueprint still in her hands. "No rush, but I'd like to get started soon." Clara watched him walk away, the paper clutched tightly in her fingers. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel quite so bleak. But with hope came uncertainty, and as much as she wanted to believe in Arthur's vision, she couldn't ignore the risks. She glanced at the blueprint again, her mind swirling with questions and possibilities. Whatever came next, she knew one thing for certain. Her life was no longer the same, and there was no going back. The air was thick with tension as Clara walked through the crowded marketplace. The whispers had grown louder, the stares more pointed. Her neighbors, who had once been a source of quiet solidarity, now seemed to regard her with suspicion. She could feel their unspoken judgments trailing her like shadows. Why her? What did she do to deserve this? At the vegetable stand, Clara tried to focus on her work, but the weight of their scrutiny made her hands clumsy. Her usual customers hesitated, their smiles replaced with guarded nods. She fought the urge to confront them, to explain that nothing about her had changed except the size of her dreams. By midday, the sun beat down relentlessly, and Clara paused to wipe her brow. It was then that she noticed a figure approaching. Arthur, his presence unmistakable even from a distance. Dressed in a more casual shirt and slacks, he still stood out like a polished gem in a sea of weathered stones. "You shouldn't be here," Clara said the moment he reached her stand. Her voice was low but firm, tinged with frustration. Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Good morning to you too," Clara sighed, glancing around nervously. "People are talking, Arthur. They think there's something between us." "Let them talk," he replied calmly. "I'm not here for them. I'm here for you." His words, simple yet loaded, caught her off guard. She set down the basket of onions in her hands, crossing her arms defensively. "You don't understand. Your presence makes everything harder. People don't trust what they don't understand." Arthur leaned against the stand, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe it's time we changed that." "How?" Clara scoffed. "By walking around in your expensive shoes, pretending you belong here?" Her words were sharper than she intended, but Arthur didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered notebook. "This belonged to my grandfather," he said, handing it to her. Clara hesitated, then took it. The leather cover was cracked with age, the pages filled with handwritten notes and sketches. As she flipped through it, she saw entries detailing daily sales, lists of customers, and ideas for expanding his small grocery business. One page caught her eye, a sketch of a modest storefront with the words "Vasconcellos Market" scrawled beneath it. "He started with less than you have now," Arthur said softly, "and he built something that changed my family's future. But he never forgot where he came from. That's what I'm trying to do, Clara. Not for them," he gestured to the market around them, "but for you, for your kids." Clara's throat tightened as she looked at the notebook. It was a tangible reminder of how ambition, no matter how humble, could transform lives. But it also carried a weight she wasn't sure she was ready to bear. "Arthur, this isn't just about me," she said quietly. "If I fail, it won't just hurt my family. It'll hurt this whole community. They're already looking at me like I've betrayed them." Arthur straightened, his expression resolute. "Then let's show them that this isn't about betrayal. It's about possibility." Clara shook her head, her emotions a tangled mess of fear and hope. "That's easy for you to say. You have nothing to lose." "You're wrong," Arthur said, his voice dropping. "I have everything to lose. My reputation, my business, the trust of people who've stood by me for years. But none of that matters if I can't make this work." Their eyes locked, the intensity of his gaze breaking through her defenses. For the first time, Clara saw not just a wealthy man trying to do good, but a human being grappling with his own doubts and fears. Before she could respond, a familiar voice called out, "Clara!" It was Rosa, her neighbor and closest confidant. She approached with a cautious smile, her weathered face lined with curiosity. "Who's your friend?" Clara hesitated, unsure of what to say. Arthur extended his hand with a practiced ease. "Arthur Vasconcellos. I'm working with Clara on a new initiative for small businesses in the area." Rosa shook his hand, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Is that so?" She turned to Clara, her expression unreadable. "And what do you think of all this?" Clara glanced at Arthur, then back at Rosa. "I think it could help. A lot." Rosa studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Well, if Clara believes in it, I'll keep an open mind. But you'd better not let her down, Mr. Vasconcellos." Arthur smiled faintly. "I have no intention of doing that." As Rosa walked away, Clara exhaled deeply, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. Arthur noticed and stepped closer. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" Clara gave him a wry look. "Don't get used to it." Arthur chuckled but didn't press further. Instead, he reached for the notebook, still in her hands. "Keep this," he said. "Maybe it'll remind you that big changes start small." Clara hesitated, then nodded, tucking the notebook into her bag. As Arthur turned to leave, she called after him. "Arthur!" He stopped, looking back at her expectantly. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for believing in me, even when I don't." Arthur's expression softened and he nodded. "You're stronger than you think, Clara. Don't forget that." As he disappeared into the crowd, Clara stood there for a moment, the weight of the notebook pressing against her side. She glanced around the market, the familiar faces now tinged with curiosity rather than suspicion. For the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of hope, not just for herself, but for everyone who called this place home. The first whispers of trouble arrived on a rainy morning, carried by a man Clara barely knew, but whose words sent a chill through her. "You'd better watch yourself," he had muttered, leaning against her vegetable stand as he picked through a pile of onions. "People are saying Arthur Vasconcelos isn't as squeaky clean as he seems." Clara didn't respond, her hands tightening on the crate she was lifting. She had heard the rumors before, murmurs about shady business practices, communities displaced for profit, but she had brushed them off, choosing instead to focus on the changes she was beginning to see in her own life. But now, the weight of those words lingered. The day dragged on, the rain turning the market into a maze of muddy puddles. When Arthur appeared, his coat drenched and his usually pristine hair slightly disheveled, Clara's first instinct was to brush him off. She didn't have the energy to deal with his charm or his unwavering optimism, but his expression stopped her. There was something different in his eyes, something unsettled. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. Clara nodded reluctantly, motioning for him to follow her to the back of the stand, where an old tarp provided some shelter from the rain. Once they were alone, Arthur ran a hand through his damp hair, the weight of whatever he was carrying evident in his posture. "What's going on?" Clara asked, crossing her arms. Arthur hesitated, his jaw tightening. "There's been pushback from the board. They're questioning the resources I've put into the grant program. Some of them are threatening to pull out of other projects unless I scale it back." Clara felt a flicker of anger rise in her chest. "So, what does that mean? You're pulling out too?" Arthur's head shot up, his eyes locking onto hers. "No, absolutely not. I'm not backing down, Clara, but it's complicated." "Complicated?" Clara's voice was sharp, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "Do you have any idea what it's like to put your trust in someone only to have them take it away? If you're going to walk away, just say it." "I'm not walking away," Arthur snapped, his voice uncharacteristically harsh. "But I can't fight this alone. I need you to trust me, even when it looks like everything's falling apart." Clara's chest tightened. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that he wasn't like the other men who had promised change only to disappear when things got hard. But the doubts she had buried for weeks came rushing to the surface. "People are talking, Arthur," she said quietly, "about you, about your business. They're saying you've hurt communities like mine before." Arthur flinched, his expression darkening. "I won't lie to you, Clara. I've made decisions I'm not proud of. I've put profit above people more times than I can count, but I'm trying to be better. I'm trying to make things right. And how do I know this isn't just another business move for you?" Clara's voice cracked, her emotions threatening to spill over. "How do I know you won't cut your losses and walk away the moment this gets too messy?" Arthur stepped closer, his gaze steady. "You don't," he said simply. "You don't know. And I can't promise I won't make mistakes, but what I can promise is that I won't stop trying. Not for you, not for your kids, not for this community. If you'll let me, I'll prove it." Clara stared at him, her heart pounding. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of being let down again was almost paralyzing. She thought of Lucas and Mariana, of the hope that had flickered in their eyes when Arthur first entered their lives. If she pushed him away now, what would that teach them about trust, about taking risks? Finally she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, Arthur exhaled, relief washing over his face. "Thank you. I won't let you down." As they stepped back into the rain, the market seemed quieter than usual. Clara returned to her stand, her mind spinning with everything Arthur had said. The doubts lingered, but so did something else, something stronger: hope. Later that evening, as she tucked Lucas and Mariana into bed, Clara found herself staring at the blueprint Arthur had given her weeks ago. She traced the lines with her finger, imagining what their world could look like if it became a reality. For the first time, the dream didn't feel so far away. But dreams, she reminded herself, were fragile things, and they required more than hope. They required action. Meanwhile, Arthur sat alone in his office, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. His phone buzzed with messages from the board, their frustrations laid bare in curt, pointed words. He ignored them, his focus on the framed photo of his grandfather that sat on his desk. "You believed in people," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I need to start doing the same." The rain continued to fall outside, its steady rhythm filling the silence. Both Arthur and Clara knew the road ahead would be anything but easy, but for now, they had taken the first step, and that, they realized, was the beginning of something far greater than either of them could imagine. The night was restless. Clara lay awake in her small bed, staring at the cracked ceiling as the weight of the day pressed down on her. The doubts whispered incessantly in her mind. What if this fails? What if he fails? What if I fail? Every decision she had made since meeting Arthur felt like a gamble, and the stakes were impossibly high. In the corner of the room, Lucas and Mariana slept soundly, their dreams untouched by the fears that haunted their mother. Clara envied their innocence, their ability to believe that everything would work out simply because it always had, but she knew better. The world was rarely kind, and second chances were a luxury most people didn't get. Morning came with a knock at the door. Clara frowned, wiping her hands on her apron as she opened it to find Rosa standing there, her face tight with worry. "You'd better come with me," Rosa said without preamble. "There's something you need to see." Clara followed her neighbor through the narrow streets, her heart pounding with every step. When they reached the center of the marketplace, she stopped short. A group of men in suits stood beside Arthur, their expressions grim. They were flanked by two other men she recognized as city officials. A small crowd had gathered, their murmurs filled with suspicion and unease. "What's going on?" Clara demanded, her voice cutting through the noise. Arthur turned to her, his face a mask of calm, though she could see the tension in his jaw. "The board sent them," he said quietly. "They're investigating the grant program." Clara's stomach dropped. "Investigating? What does that mean?" One of the suited men stepped forward. "It means there are concerns about the allocation of resources," he said, his tone clipped. "We need to ensure that everything has been done above board." Clara clenched her fists, anger rising in her chest. "Above board? You think we're stealing from you?" "Clara," Arthur said softly, trying to placate her, but she wasn't having it. "No," she snapped, rounding on him. "You said this was about helping people, but now they're here, treating us like criminals. What did you expect?" Arthur held her gaze, his calm cracking just enough for her to see the turmoil beneath. "I didn't expect this, but I'll handle it." "Handle it?" Clara's voice was sharp, her anger laced with fear. "What happens if they decide this isn't worth it? What happens to my stand, to my family?" Before Arthur could respond, one of the officials interjected. "We're not shutting anything down yet, but we need to see proof that this program is benefiting the community and not just a select few." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The crowd murmured, their unease growing. Clara felt the weight of their eyes on her. their silent judgments pressing down on her shoulders. She looked at Arthur, her trust in him teetering on the edge. "Fine," she said finally, her voice trembling with restrained emotion. "You want proof? Come with me." She led the group through the market, stopping at stalls run by people she had helped with the grant money. She introduced them to Maria, who had expanded her flower business, and Luis, who had finally been able to buy new tools for his repair shop. At each stop, the officials listened, their expressions inscrutable, while Arthur stood silently by her side. By the time they returned to the center of the market, Clara was exhausted. She turned to the officials, her voice firm despite her fatigue. "These are the people you're questioning, hard-working people who are finally getting a chance to make their lives better. If that's not enough for you, then maybe this program was a mistake after all." The crowd murmured in agreement, their support emboldening Clara. One of the officials nodded slowly, his demeanor softening. "It's not a mistake," he said, "but we'll need to continue monitoring the program closely." The group dispersed, leaving Clara and Arthur standing alone. She turned to him, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. "This is why I didn't want to get involved." Arthur looked at her, his expression a mix of regret and determination. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't anticipate this, but I'll fix it." "How?" Clara demanded. "How can you fix something like this? These people don't trust you, or me. And now, thanks to you, I'm the one they're looking at like I don't belong." Arthur didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the notebook he had given her weeks ago. "You said you wanted to make a difference," he said. "And you have. But change isn't easy, Clara. It's messy, and it's slow, and it doesn't always go the way we want it to, but that doesn't mean it's not worth fighting for." Clara stared at him, the fire in her chest dimming just enough for his words to sink in. She wanted to argue, to push him away and retreat to the safety of her old life. But something in his voice stopped her. It wasn't just determination, it was faith. Faith in her, in what they were trying to build together. "Okay," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if this falls apart, it's on you." Arthur nodded, his expression softening. "Fair enough." As the crowd began to disperse, Clara turned back to her stand, her thoughts racing. The doubts hadn't disappeared, but they were no longer all-consuming. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could weather this storm together. The day of the big announcement arrived, a crisp and sunny morning that seemed almost out of place in Clara's modest neighborhood. The market buzzed with anticipation. The usually skeptical crowd gathered near a makeshift stage Arthur had arranged in the center of the square. Clara stood off to the side, her nerves a tangled knot as she watched Arthur climb the wooden steps. He wasn't wearing his usual tailored suit. Today, he'd opted for a simple shirt and slacks, blending in just enough to make his presence feel less imposing. But his posture, the way he commanded the space with quiet confidence, reminded everyone, including Clara, that he was no ordinary man. Arthur stepped up to the microphone, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady but warm. "Thank you all for being here today. I know many of you have questions about me, about this program, about what we're trying to achieve together, and I know trust isn't built overnight." A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd, but Arthur pressed on. "When I first came here, I didn't know what to expect. I came looking for answers, for something I felt was missing in my life. What I found was a community filled with strength, resilience, and dreams that deserved to be realized." He paused, letting his words settle. Clara felt her heart tighten, the raw sincerity in his voice catching her off guard. "This program," Arthur continued, gesturing to the small group of beneficiaries standing nearby, "isn't about charity. It's about opportunity. It's about investing in people, not because they need saving, but because they've already proven their worth through their hard work and determination. The crowd was silent now, their attention fully captured. Arthur turned to Clara, his next words directed as much at her as at everyone else. Change isn't easy. It's uncomfortable and it comes with risks, but it's also necessary. And I believe in this community's ability to rise above the challenges, to prove that together we can create something lasting. He stepped aside, motioning for Clara to join him on stage. She hesitated, her pulse quickening as the crowd's eyes shifted to her. But Arthur's gaze was steady, encouraging, and she found herself walking toward him before she could overthink it. When she reached the microphone, the weight of the moment pressed down on her. She glanced at Arthur, who gave her a small nod, and then at the crowd, the people she had grown up with, worked alongside, and fought to protect. "I'm not good at speeches," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "But I want to say thank you, not just to Arthur, but to all of you, for believing in this, for believing in me." Her voice grew steadier as she continued. "When this started, I was scared. I didn't know if it would work or if it would just make things harder for all of us. But standing here today, seeing what we've already accomplished together, I know it's worth it." The crowd broke into applause, and Clara stepped back, overwhelmed but grateful. Arthur returned to the microphone, his expression resolute. "Today, I'm proud to announce the official launch of the Community Empowerment Fund, a long-term initiative that will provide resources, mentorship, and support to small businesses like Clara's across this city." The announcement was met with cheers, the tension of weeks past dissolving into a wave of cautious optimism. Arthur's voice carried over the noise, firm and clear. "This is just the beginning. The work doesn't stop here. Together we can build a future where everyone has a chance to thrive." As the applause swelled, Clara felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Rosa, her neighbor, beaming with pride. "You did it," Rosa whispered. "You really did it." Clara smiled, a mix of relief and hope washing over her. But it wasn't just her. It was Arthur, the community, the children who now had a reason to dream bigger. They had done it together. As the event wound down, Arthur found Clara standing near her stand, watching Lucas and Mariana play with some of the other children. He approached quietly, his hands tucked into his pockets. "You were amazing up there," he said. Clara glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "So were you." Arthur hesitated, then added, "This is just the start, Clara. There's so much more we can do." She nodded, her gaze softening. "I know, and I'm ready." Before he could respond, Mariana ran over, her face alight with excitement. "Mom, everyone loved the speech. Can we do more of these?" Clara laughed, scooping her daughter into her arms. "We'll see, sweetheart." Arthur watched them with a quiet smile, a sense of fulfillment settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be, not in the boardrooms or the penthouses, but here, where his work had a heartbeat. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments below. What would you have done in Clara's shoes? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this, where ordinary lives intersect with extraordinary moments of change. As the sun set over the market, painting the sky in hues of gold and amber, Clara and Arthur stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next. Their journey wasn't over, but for now, they allowed themselves to celebrate what they had built, a bridge between two worlds, held together by hope, trust, and the promise of a brighter future.